Welcome, everyone. My name is Jessica Hoffler. I'm the program director here at Cambia Grove. We started this Lunch and Learn program a couple years back, and it has evolved over the years. Starting in 2018, we partnered with Echo Health Ventures to help build the curriculum. We decided they were better experts than we were at understanding what startups and other innovators need to understand as they mature throughout the year. So with that in mind, I would like to pass it over to Matt Parmet from Echo Health Ventures, who will talk a little bit about the topic today.
Thanks, Jessica, and thanks everyone for coming. It's good to have you in the Grove. So as Jessica mentioned, I'm with Echo Health Ventures on our investing team, and we work with very many early stage startups, both in and out of the portfolio, and get a lot of questions about the sales cycle and implementation and the RFP and procurement process and the legal process of securing your BAA and all the things that it takes to actually complete a sale in the complex healthcare world. And oftentimes the procurement process gets lumped in with the broader sales cycle, and entrepreneurs a lot of times will feel like they've made a sale and then get hit with the procurement process and then have to go through the RFP process and then have to get their legal contracts in place. And so probably the biggest point of feedback we always receive about the go-to-market strategy for a lot of our startups is the sales cycle is a lot longer than we expected. Because once you've quote unquote made the sale, there's a lot of work that's still left to be done. And so we're excited to have Martha and Lyra from DWT come and chat about some of the more technical aspects of what it takes to actually complete a sale, especially as an early stage startup that's running fairly lean. So I'll ask them to come up and take it away from here, Martha and Lyra.
So hi, welcome. We're glad to be here. So as Matt mentioned, we're with Davis Wright Tremaine. We are in the tech transactions and privacy and security practice, and we do work with a number of technology companies as well as healthcare organizations and healthcare providers and people sort of in that space and adjacent to that space. The topic is meant to be as useful as possible to the people who are here. So you should feel free to stop us and ask questions, and we are happy to also try to walk through scenarios with you while we go through some of this. We basically have two sets of content that we're going to cover. One is sort of procurement process. What does it consist of? Why is it what it is? What are some helpful ways to think about it, and what are some helpful sort of tips and tricks in managing it? It doesn't really contain any legal content per se. It's more just based on experience in dealing with procurement organizations. The second part, it deals with the specifics of the BAA to help you understand sort of like why people take it very seriously, why you should take it seriously, why it's important, what the content consists of, what are the variables, etc. So that's our plan for today. So this is who we are. We just talked about that. We have cards if you want to contact us, but I think there's also an information sheet that has our contact information on it. Yep. So basically, I'm a private practice attorney currently, and I work with companies. But before I did that, I was an attorney in-house with very large companies that had procurement organizations. So in part, my experience and what I'm going to talk about is based on what I saw from firsthand experience and how these things operated from my perspective as the legal partner, right, to the business team that was often trying to get their deals done. And I will just disclaim that, opinions and thoughts are my own. They may not apply to everyone who's in a procurement organization, but they tend to be sort of like common threads that we see throughout the industry. So what is a useful way to think about a procurement organization and what they do? They are typically a corporate function. They're not necessarily aligned with a business or a business unit. They are part of sort of corporate oversight for the corporation as an organization. Typically, if you want to think of their alignment within the organization, they're often aligned with the finance and accounting organization. And this can mean that they typically pay attention to issues around cost reduction. So if you are, a startup and you think you have closed your deal with your business partner within that organization, the procurement department in part sees themselves as a gatekeeper for the organization, and they want to understand how to justify the spend because they're going to be asked to do that. And so when they ask questions along the way, it's often through that particular lens. What are we getting for this spend? How is this better than we could have been spending the money on an alternative system or solution? And how are we meeting our goals for efficiency, cost reduction, bettering the organization? And they typically have oversight for negotiating all kinds of inbound agreements, right? They may not have specific expertise in the industry or area that your product is in. For example, they're going to be negotiating, purchases of carpet and chairs and tables in this room, and vending machines, and they're also going to be probably doing some very complex IT implementations and infrastructure deals. But you never know who you're going to get, right? The person you get assigned to may or may not have a competency in your area, so that's one thing to keep in mind. They typically work hand in hand with the legal team, although I think it depends on the organization. Sometimes procurement teams have I don't want to say more latitude, but a lot of times if the legal team maybe doesn't have bandwidth, they will let the procurement team run with certain things. So that is what they are. How do they see themselves in their function? What I've seen is a lot of times they do not see themselves as a business enabler. That's not what they're there for. You have a person that's your contact who's in that role. That's your business counterpart that you personally sold the deal to. And I think the procurement team often sees themselves in sort of an almost oppositional function, right? They are there to explain to the corporation why the deal is a good deal, why it's going to benefit the corporation, and why the corporation should do it, basically. They do not have a huge amount of latitude or creativity in what they can negotiate in an actual document. So they may hand you what they say is a quote-unquote standard document, and they may say, well, this is our standard contract. We need you to sign our standard contract. They may not have a huge amount of content behind the why of that, and there may not be a huge amount of content behind the why of that. The why may just be, well, this is how we do things. That can be an extraordinarily frustrating answer for people. This is how we do things, but sometimes you're not going to get beyond it, and it may just be frustrating to keep trying to get beyond it, depending on how big your deal is, right? The dollar value of your deal could dictate how much attention and focus your deal is going to get, and if there are much bigger deals that the procurement team is working on at the same time, then your deal is probably not going to get a huge amount of attention, unless it's bad attention because they see it as a risky type thing that is not just driving up cost but driving up risk for the company. Because so the two things they tend to care about are risk and cost. This middle bullet point here is something that people may not realize. Often procurement departments have specific cost reduction goals, and they are looking for metrics with every single contract that they negotiate, where they want to be able to say at the end of the contract process, and I've seen people who even have like forms that they are expected to fill out at the end of the contract process, stating, okay, here's how we reduced cost for the company by entering into this deal. Either you're replacing something that cost more, or you're going to drive efficiencies somehow so that they're going to drop a head count based on your deal, or some other type of cost reduction thing. And that's a very specific lens that they'll be looking at your deal through. And these last two bullet points really have to do with what we talked about in terms of when they say, this is our standard contract. If they object to something that you think is an important business term, and they don't have a good reason for objecting to it, but they just say, well, this is our standard. That can get stuck, and I've seen it get stuck. But typically, the procurement people, if you need to escalate, are probably not going to be the right people who can help you get it resolved, because they typically do not have latitude for driving creative solutions. That's probably going to be an escalation from your business partner that you're working with to somebody who is a lawyer for the company, especially if they have an in-house legal team. Okay, so how do you problem solve when you get into some of these situations with procurement teams that can be challenging? This is what I like to say: when you first start the deal process, try to understand from your business partner who are all the stakeholders, who are all the corporate departments throughout the organization that are going to have a say in whether this contract gets signed, and be expected to approve it at the very end before it can get signed, so that you do not get to the very end of your process, what you think is the very end, and then find out there's another 2-week process beyond that for approvers, right? It has to go through risk management, it has to go through finance, it has to go through procurement, it has to go through compliance, et cetera. So if you can have that conversation at the very beginning of the contract negotiation, you'll save yourselves pain on the back end. And you can also drive some accountability with your business partner that way too, because what I found often is the business partners may or may not have been through the process many times themselves. If they haven't been through it many times, they may not have that whole list in their mind either, and it may help them to realize they're going to have to do that. And I would say, you know, you can gauge from how the negotiation is going whether or not you need to take a pause at certain points in the negotiation to re-ask that question, sort of like, a lot of times it's IT teams, right, security teams, has your security team had a chance to review this piece of the contract? Are they okay with it? Do they have any questions? Do they need to talk to our technical people? So a lot of times there are just stakeholders that may get raised at the end, and you may see it as a blocker, but if you can bring them up as the negotiation is ongoing, you'll be better off. And I would say also ask specifically about the role that the procurement team will be playing, right? Are they going to be running the contract process and scheduling the meetings? If so, it's probably worth it to try to build a very good relationship with them right up front. They like to feel like they have an important role. They like to feel like that they're adding a lot of value to the process. And I would say, you know, if you can work on making, not to say making them feel special, but making them feel like that's an important role that you also value, I think it'll be better for everyone in the end. Okay, so which are the terms that are likely to come up if you have a contract and you're getting into the weeds? Which are the terms that are likely to come up with the procurement team as things that they're going to tell you, that's a deal killer for us, we have to have that. And that is because they are working with a standard playbook. They're not just free-form negotiating contracts. They're working from a standard playbook. They have rules around what they can and cannot change in any contract, and around what they can and cannot accept in any contract. I've seen the most likely things I've seen are termination for convenience. They're always going to want it, no matter what. They always want to know if they don't like the deal, they can get out. And they're always going to want to know that they can get a refund if they're prepaid and they do get out. They care deeply about the risk allocation terms, so limitations on liability, and particularly indemnification and indemnification scope. And then the security requirements and provisions around security breach are usually very, very important to them too. And that particular one, that's where I find it's helpful to not let them drive the conversation necessarily, but say, why don't we get your security team talking to our technical team, and maybe the two of them can have a conversation, because often there's more content that you're able to share that way that can alleviate people's fears. I guess I would throw in IP rights too. It tends to be a big one. Especially if you're going to say, we want rights to usage or performance data. Usually that becomes a scary thought for people, because they don't necessarily know what it means. They don't understand the technical or security aspects behind it or how things will be protected. They just know these are scary concepts. And so actually that's what this slide is really about, I think. Did I put that on here? Not really. But the fear around data usage, data rights, and IP ownership, I think just really comes from a place of being conversant in the topics enough to know that they are topics that cause people a lot of angst, but without really having the deep knowledge required to be able to negotiate those terms in a way that a legal department would or an outside lawyer would. And that's why I think procurement teams can get stuck on some of those terms. I would say if you're going to get stuck on the data term, like usage data, performance data, I would say that's when you get your technical people involved and start talking about the security. Here's how we're going to protect it. Here are the specific security measures we're going to apply. Here's how everything works. Because when you start doing that, that can make them feel better. Days payable, another thing that's very important to them. Okay. So what can you do about it? We talked about making them look good within their organization a little bit because they're expected to drive cost reduction. So can you help them do that? Do you have any facts or data that back up why your solution is a better solution in that particular regard for them, right? They're not going to necessarily adopt your marketing talking points wholesale, right? But it could be helpful for them if you have a story to tell them about why you think your solution is a cost-effective solution and could help their business, right? Because that's the exact type of thing they're looking for when they have to go justify it up the corporate ladder. Are you able to provide flexibility on any of the terms that they care a huge amount about, right? So if you look at payment terms, for example, and you want to get paid on 30 days, they want to pay on 60. Okay, could you accept 60 days? Could you offer them, an early pay discount? Sometimes you see companies that care deeply about, we want a 2% discount if we pay your invoice within 10 days. So if you make concessions in places where you have flexibility, sometimes that can drive the goodwill to get some of the other things that you care about. Yeah. And so those would be my tips on working with procurement departments and sort of like what makes them tick, why they think the way they do, why they operate the way they do. And I think the BAA stuff, to tie this in and with Lyra's topic, the BAA stuff is a similar area where things can get stuck. Also, in part because sometimes you're dealing with non-lawyers who are negotiating deeply legal terms, who do not have a lot of latitude given to them to make bespoke changes, and also driven from a place of fear where people understand it to a degree but don't understand it deeply enough to really know what the right thing is. So, but before we go over there, any questions on the procurement topic? Nope. Okay.
Thanks, Martha. So as Martha was saying before, a lot of the times when you start the procurement process with health systems, you will get a standard template. And a lot of the times that standard template will contain a business associate agreement. And as Martha was saying, the health system may give it to you and say, this is our standard template, we want you to sign it. And especially for those that are not as familiar with what it is, what it entails, you sign it without really sort of knowing what your obligations are. So this presentation really just kind of focuses on sort of what is a business associate agreement and what your responsibilities will be under that agreement as well as under HIPAA. So first things first, what is HIPAA? To harken back to one of Martha's slides, she said that one of the first things you want to do is you want to try to make the organization look good. One of the worst things that you can do is to spell HIPAA wrong, because if you're trying to sell yourself on being an expert and having great privacy and security, you want to make sure that you spell HIPAA correctly. So to get it out of the way, it is 1 P and 2 A's. And the one sort of marker, the one sort of tip I always like to say is, if it looks too much like the word hippo, you need to go back and do a spell check. So, but I think a lot of you are familiar with HIPAA in the context of going to your doctor. You'll go to your doctor, they say, hey, you have to sign this because of HIPAA. But you know, what is it? And it's really a law and a rule that protects the privacy and security of a patient's protected health information. And it also gives them certain rights to that health information, like access, amending, and accountability. So, so just a quick summary. HIPAA protects protected health information, and for our purposes, what you need to know is that protected health information is defined very broadly. It's generally any individually identifiable information about a patient's health, and as long as it's tied to a covered entity or to a health system, like demographic information by itself, that is PHI. So it doesn't necessarily have to have any treatment or diagnostic information. As long as it's tied to a covered entity, it will be considered PHI. So a lot of the times I like to use payment information. If a payment information is breached, but it comes from a covered entity, more than likely, 95% of the time that will be considered PHI. And I think that's something to be aware of when you start working with a covered entity, is trying to make a determination as to sort of what information you really are kind of storing, accessing, for the covered entity. And HIPAA is applicable to covered entities and business associates. So before 2013, business associates, so subcontractors, were generally only contractually tied to HIPAA. So their only obligations were in the contracts with the covered entities. But in 2013, everything changed. And the Department of Health and Human Services wanted to make sure that the business associates were directly liable under HIPAA. So nowadays, if you sign a business associate agreement, one thing to be aware of is that you will be directly liable under HIPAA, and you will be subject to any penalties if you violate the rules. So, they give you a standard template. You look at it and you're like, am I a business associate even? What I like to say is, if you are a person or entity that creates, receives, maintains, or transmits PHI on behalf of a covered entity, you are a business associate. But for example, if the only thing you process is employee information, so if you have like HR software, for example, that is not something that is a business associate function. So take a look at the information that you have and that you're going to have access to, and really ask yourself, is this PHI? Is this going to be something, is that the type of information that I will maintain, create on behalf of the covered entity? And if not, it's worth it to bring it up to the procurement team to say, hey, you know what? I don't have this information. I'm not a business associate. I don't think I have to sign this. They're not always going to agree. As Martha says, they're fickle creatures over in the procurement department. But it's worth at least, sort of bringing up to them and asking about it. So these are sort of the typical examples of what a business associate includes. Kind of the big things here are IT vendors. So if you're a cloud storage vendor, you're going to be a business associate. Offsite storage, computer system support. If you offer software to the health system, for example, and you are going to offer, support to them, and in that support you're going to have access to PHI, that will tie you in, and you are going to be a business associate. So, something to keep in mind. So, you're a business associate, now what? You're going to have to sign a business associate agreement before before you receive or have access to any PHI, and you will now be subject to the HIPAA and contractual obligations. So I gave a handout, I think most people have it, about sort of what the contractual obligations are under a business associate. Under a business associate agreement, if you do not have one, let me know and I can give you one afterwards. So what you'll see from the handout is that typically a business associate agreement will have both sort of required terms as well as sort of optional elements, and it'll have required terms and sort of optional elements, and you'll see there some of the terms that we have. We're handing out some more. So. But most importantly, and I think this is a point that a lot of sort of newer companies who may not be as familiar with this process, is once you sign a BAA, you will have direct HIPAA obligations. That means that you will be required to directly comply with the law. And most importantly, you will be subject to the HIPAA security rule. And all that is, it's a bunch of safeguards to protect electronic health information. But what people don't realize is that the security rule has about 50 requirements that you have to comply with. And for all those 50 requirements, you have to have written documentation, and it'll require you to get a risk assessment, to see the kind of information that you have on hand, what safeguards you have on hand to protect that information. So for a lot of those that are new to the health system, keep that in mind, that when you sign a BAA, compliance with HIPAA takes a long time, and it takes a while, and a lot of the time during the procurement process, because you're going to be contractually obligated to kind of those requirements, maybe the covered entity would like to see some of that. And a lot of the time, business associate agreements will have those audit rights where a covered entity can come in and say, hey, you know what? I want to see what you have for XYZ and for the security rule. So just keep that in mind. And then the other thing too is because you are directly liable to HIPAA, the Department of Health and Human Services can come in and for any violations, investigate you for any breaches. So they can come in and directly request any of the required documentation that you have. But most importantly, they're able to levy penalties upon your organization. And these can range, actually they changed it recently, so it's a lot less than it was, but it's still pretty hefty. So they can range from $25,000 annually max to $1.5 million annually. And that's per violation. So one violation could be 1.5 million, another violation could be 1.5 million, and so on and so forth. So HIPAA compliance is really important to kind of avoid those penalties. And I don't want to scare anyone. Most of the time, the Health and Human Services will take some time and work with you to make sure that you can be compliant. They're not out there to want to punish people. They really do want to make sure that the information of patients is protected. So I think there's only been about 70, penalties handed out of the hundreds of thousands of complaints they get every year. So, but it's good to have that in place in order to kind of prevent those from happening. Don't forget about your subcontractors. If you have any subcontractors that will house any of the information that you store on behalf of the health system, you're going to want to make sure that they also sign a business associate agreement. And the business associate agreement needs to make sure that it is just as protective as the one that you signed with the health system. So here are some oh, yes. Yep. Yeah, so they recently decreased the penalties. It used to be that the maximum penalty for each violation was 1.5 million, but now the sort of minimum minimum penalty that they have for violations that you may not have been aware of, but were not negligent about is 25,000. So, or I think it's 20, yeah, it's 25,000. So it is a lot lower than it was before. I think minimal it starts at 100 and it goes up to a max of 25,000. There's 4 different tiers of penalties depending on the level of culpability that you have for the violation. So. It doesn't go up. It just really depends on sort of the level. For example, if you were completely negligent and you were completely aware of that violation, so you knew that your systems were deficient and you knew this whole time and you let it go, you're going to get that maximum penalty every time. And just know that it counts per violation. So if you violated, one part of HIPAA and you violated another part of HIPAA, those both count as separate penalties. So here's some recommendations. Start your HIPAA compliance plan early, and or if you have one, just make sure to review it periodically to make sure that you are on track. Keep track of your obligations under business associate agreements. Every business associate agreement is different. Every health system will have different risks that they take into consideration when kind of drafting these. And so you just want to make sure, like a lot of the time, business associate agreements will have different reporting obligations. So maybe one health system will say, you know what, if you have a breach, take 10 days, you have 10 days to report it to us. But sometimes some hospitals will say you only have 5 days. So just make sure to keep that in mind as you sort of go through. It's always good to have sort of a vendor kind of contract management program if you have one. And then also keep track of your subcontractors to make sure that they've all signed their business associate agreements. And one thing that's not mentioned here or on the sheet as well is that a lot of the time the business associate agreement will contain like standard contractual terms, so indemnification, limitations of liability, and things like that. So, great. Does anyone have any questions for me? Or oh, hey, Martha. Mm-hmm. So, as Martha was saying before, there isn't a ton of wiggle room with HIPAA. I mean, it sort of lists what its requirements are. But what will happen a lot of the time with health systems is they'll want to kind of strengthen some of their requirements and maybe tweak it to give themselves some benefits. So, for example, the provision that I see change the most is there's a provision that requires business associates to give access to Health and Human Services to come in and have access to their books, their records, things like that. And a lot of the times the health systems will tweak it to say, you will give HHS and us the right to see your books. That is not required under HIPAA. So to the extent that you want to stick to the HIPAA requirements, just kind of look through that sheet or look through the regulations to see if they put in kind of extra requirements. The one thing I think that they always change are the timeframes for reporting. And so if you think you need more time, it's always good to ask. If you think sort of business-wise, instead of 10 days, you would need 15 days. So, yes. Yeah, so actually, let me go back to that slide. Nope, that was the wrong way. So with your subcontractors, as you can see, your only obligation in terms of a business associate is with the covered entity. They don't have any connections to any subcontractors that you may have. So, but any violations of your subcontractor will ultimately fall on you. So if they have a violation, their obligation is to report it to you as the business associate, not to the covered entity. And as the business associate, ultimately, if it's a breach of HIPAA, if it ends up being a HIPAA violation, it may fall on you, but it may also fall on the covered entity. So OCR could levy fines against both organizations if that's the case. But I think what's important here too is there's, along with HIPAA violations, there's always a loss of reputation. And so that kind of reputational loss is really important to take into consideration when you sign a subcontractor or a business associate. Do your due diligence, really see if they have the requirements in place to protect the information that you house. And one of the ways that you can do that is to make sure that you have all the contractual elements, and to see if you can, a lot of the time what they'll have is you can have a conversation with their technical team or their security team to kind of give you a rundown about sort of what they have in place to protect the information.